Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, July 29th, 2019. I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And before we dive into the show, I want to thank those of you who have made Talk Nerdy possible this week. Remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download, and that's because of the support from listeners just like you. And at the top tier of patrons, the club is getting a bit small, so I just want to thank Phil T-Bear, the Zombie Drummer, David J. E. Smith, Brian Holden, and Jeffrey Sewell for their support. Of course, there are dozens more of you who support the show each week, and I thank you very, very much. If you would like to continue to support the show or support at a new level, all you need to do is go to patreon.com/talknerdy. Going through some big life changes right now. Definitely could use the support because it's becoming increasingly difficult to push through, especially through these transitions, which possibly I'll share with you soon. Either way, I think that's kind of neither here nor there. Ultimately, I just want to thank you all so much for continuing to listen to the show, for sharing it with your friends and family. It really means a lot to me, your loyalty to Talk Nerdy. And of course, I hope that we can continue our relationship well into the future. I mean, goodness, we are on, episode 268. Can you believe that? That means we've been doing this for over 5 years already. And I can't thank you enough for your continued support of the show. Okay, enough of my gushing. I'm very excited to present to you a wonderful conversation today with Annaka Harris. She's the author of the new book, Conscious, A Brief Guide to the Fundamental Mystery of the Mind. This is a really fascinating chat, and I think it's quite expanding in many ways. It's going to give you a lot to think about and absolutely a lot to talk about. So guys, without any further ado, and I almost forgot to mention, guys, Annaka's guided meditations and lessons for kids are all available on the Waking Up Meditation app. It's at waking.com. And some are available for free on her website at annakaharris.com. So I highly recommend that you check them out right now. Well, first listen to the show and then check them out. Okay, again, without any further ado, here she is, Annaka Harris. Well, Annaka, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm excited to see you. It's been, I think, 8 years.
8 years. That is so bananas.
It is.
Oh my gosh. And you know what? When we did spend the little amount of time that we were able to spend together so long ago, I really felt connected to you.
Yeah.
And the cool thing is we have kept in touch.
Yes.
I've been able to read your books as they come out, and we've been able to correspond a little, but it's so cool to actually be in person today.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I'm glad it worked out.
Yay. Yeah. Okay, so I'm really excited because you are on a book tour right now for your newest book. You also previously wrote a gorgeous children's book.
Thank you.
And we're going to get into both of those, but you also brought these really cool cards for me and that I didn't even know about, that you put together with, is this Susan Kaiser Greenland?
Yes, that's how you say it. Yeah, she's wonderful. I've been volunteering for her organization. It's been since 2009. So how many years is that?
10 years.
Sorry, longer than that. I think it was 2005, actually.
Oh, geez.
Anyway, yes, I've known her a very long time. She has created what I think is the most brilliant curriculum to teach mindfulness meditation to children. And I immediately wanted to help her when I found out about what she was doing. And so I've been volunteering, teaching meditation to children in schools since then. And then a couple years ago, we did this project together where I helped her put her curriculum on individual cards to make them more accessible to teachers and parents.
This is huge. I mean, I can say without a doubt, this is going to come in so handy for me working with the adolescent teens that I work with in my clinical practicum, because it's mindful games activity cards, and they're big, bold cards. 55 fun ways to share mindfulness with kids and teens. I'm always trying to come up with good mindfulness activities, especially because my teen girls are very resistant to therapy oftentimes.
Yeah.
And mindfulness is one of those things that's like, it's so important, but it's kind of scary on its surface, don't you think?
Yes. Yeah, well, I think it can be. I think the idea of sitting in meditation can be intimidating. But also just, especially if you're dealing with difficult issues in your life, just sitting still and paying attention to how you're feeling can be challenging.
Really threatening.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And even, I think it's even the case for, I don't know, like all of us, like even people who maybe didn't suffer from severe trauma or people who are older and have been really set in their ways for a long time. The first time you meditate, the first time you sit around.
No, it's difficult for everyone. And I always tell that to the kids that I'm teaching. In fact, I'll often say to them, especially when they first have started learning and they're actually sitting for a few minutes in meditation, I often will end that first meditation with, you just did something that most grownups have never done. This is really hard. And it is. It's a hard thing to learn, as beneficial as it is, and how immediately you can feel the benefits sometimes, or often, I would say. No, it's like learning a new instrument. It's like learning how to play the piano. You're using your brain in a way that you've probably never used it before, and it takes a lot of training. So, yeah.
And one of the things I often hear from like friends, kind of adults who, when I recommend meditating, or, you should try, the Calm app, or you should, try out these cards, like these different approaches. And there was like, I don't want to be alone with my own thoughts.
Yeah.
Like I'm afraid of what I'll find.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's, I think, the most common fear. Yeah.
Yeah. But gosh, it really is so helpful. And you know what? I've been learning more and more about mindfulness meditation in my academic training, because my orientation in clinical psychology is actually an existential humanistic orientation. So mindfulness is actually a big part of the training, both in mind, but also in like CBT and some of the more classical evidence-based approaches. There's just so much evidence. It's just mounting and mounting and mounting that this is a real like science-based approach too.
Yeah. Well, and it really is, I mean, whether you call it mindfulness or not, it really is one of the first stages of CBT. I mean, being able to notice and recognize how you're feeling in a given situation, that's the only way you can start to modify that behavior.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, because if you don't know what it feels like to have a panic attack, or you can't recognize the symptoms. Yeah.
Or make the connection between the trigger and the experience.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, a lot of people, I think there's some version of behavioral therapy that kind of comes about naturally with people who spend a lot of time meditating, because you start to make those connections.
It's so true.
Naturally.
I actually did something for TV recently, and I guess I'm trying to think. I don't know if I'm allowed to talk about it, but I don't think I'm allowed to talk about it yet. So this might not make much sense to people. But hopefully, if they watch Brain Games, the show, which we have announced at this point, once it comes out December 1st, they'll see the episode I'm talking about. But there was an athletic thing that I did that was one of the hardest, kind of scariest things I've ever done. But because I meditate, I think I was better at it. Yeah. We were able to talk about how, that's a huge, huge part of it.
Yeah.
Like even some athletes maybe wouldn't be able to do it. So I want to talk about your new book, Conscious, A Brief Guide to the Fundamental Mystery of the Mind. But before I do, I want to talk about a little bit about your journey and your path, because you definitely have your finger on the pulse of the sort of social science, behavioral science, interpersonal, brain behavior world, but you actually come from, correct me if I'm wrong, more of like the publishing tradition, right? Or like the writing tradition?
Yes. I mean, it depends on how far back you go. I have a background in the arts, actually. I was a professional dancer. I studied dance at NYU. I had always wanted to study physics, and I tried to double major in dance and physics, and that turned out to be too challenging.
That's a lot. That's a lot. I can only imagine trying to pull that off as an undergrad.
I had one friend in the dance department who did that, and she ended up quitting dance.
Yeah.
So I think, it's one or the other. Those are both pretty full-time jobs.
Oh, for sure. With like intense emotional, intellectual, and bodily challenges, for sure.
Yeah. So when I stopped dancing, I've had a strange path, but what I eventually got into, because I had always been interested in the sciences, and that was something I wanted to study, and kind of got to a point where I was thinking about going back to school, and I found myself giving feedback and notes to some of the scientists in my life who were starting to write books.
Yeah.
And that very quickly became a career, and it's actually something that, we need more people doing, because there are very few scientists who are great communicators. And then the ones that are, even they really need help just being in touch with what it's like to know nothing about the field that they're researching.
That's almost impossible. I mean, you can be a really empathetic person and still your knowledge actually causes or produces a bit of a barrier.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And so I spent the last 12 or 13 years mostly editing for scientists who write books, but also coaching them for TED Talks and, more accessible. So all of my work just went toward trying to make scientific work more accessible. And the fields I'm most interested in are neuroscience and physics. And so those are the types of scientists I tended to work with. Consciousness has been a lifelong fascination of mine. I have literally been thinking about it for as long as I can remember.
For as long as you've been conscious?
Yeah. Not quite that long, but almost. And I became even more interested in it when I started doing a lot of work with neuroscientists. Mm-hmm. And so I just, in my free time, and when I'm driving carpool, I just found myself continually thinking more and more deeply and kind of putting together all of the different pieces of things I had learned from the sciences and from everything I'd read in philosophy. And and so this was actually a book that I tried to get a few of my clients to write, and I couldn't get anyone to write it.
You're like, fine,
so
eventually,
eventually that's what happened. And I actually didn't even get there from that. I just started writing for myself. Mm-hmm. I became kind of surprised by where I was going in my thinking and how deeply, deeply mysterious consciousness is. And I was very interested in why it's so perplexing to scientists and why it's so difficult to study. And so I actually just started writing out my own ideas because I just needed help thinking through some of these ideas.
Smart.
And I shared it with a few friends who I knew were interested, and it just kind of grew from there. It became an article, and then there were many more people. I thought I was one of the 10 nerds on planet Earth who was fascinated with the subject, and it turns out many, many people are interested, and there are almost no accessible books on the topic. And so
that's so for sure. I have like a fair amount of books on consciousness on my bookshelves, but they're always, you're right, like
very academic,
steeped in brain stuff, or very steeped in like really jargon-heavy philosophy stuff.
They're very hard to get through.
Yeah.
And so friends would ask me for recommendations, and I really could never. There was never a book that I felt like I could just hand to someone who wasn't willing to do a ton of work to get through it.
Absolutely. So a lot of stuff there. Oh my gosh, so much to unpack. The first thing that I realized when you were talking is that you are like an OG science communicator. And like an under-the-radar science communicator, which is really cool. Like, most all of my friends are SciCommers. A lot of people who have been on the show, we do the SciComm camp every year. That's kind of my core friend group. Mm-hmm. But most science communicators now are sort of like in front of the lens.
They're out there.
They're out there. Their name is, they got the byline. And you have been writing for a long time, so you have the byline. But
no, I've been writing, but we were just talking about how I tried to avoid doing this book tour.
Yes.
So this is why and how I've gone under the radar is I'm very happy working from home and writing, and I'm an introvert, as I was explaining, and love being alone and have a hard time doing things like this. So it's getting easier, but
that's good to hear that it's getting easier the longer that you're kind of in front of a crowd. But there is that thing about introverts, right? That it sucks the life out of you.
Yeah.
You're so tired at the end of the day. Yeah. Whereas I think for extroverts, that is a fundamental difference, is that it fuels them.
Yeah.
And so then they're like, oh, I have so much energy. I just got to go to this like mixer at this conference and shake off the energy. And for introverts, I consider myself one too. I'm just like, I need a nap.
Yeah. Yeah, and it can hit you hard. It's a very. I mean, I actually don't know much about the what would it be the
neurochemistry of it, or
that's what I was going to say. I mean, just the physiology of being an introvert. But I was doing an interview recently. It was long. We went for like 2.5 hours.
Oof. I won't do that to you, I promise.
It's okay. It was great. I had so much fun, and we got through a lot. But there was a point at which it was like an hour and a half in where I literally started noticing I was having these thoughts. I'm done.
Yeah.
I got to get out of here.
Yeah.
Panicky feeling that was good. I recognized, and we talked a little bit about it, and then I pushed through. But it was really hard for me to just.
I couldn't do that. I think when I did Rogan, I've been on Rogan 2 or 3 times, and he goes for like 3 hours, and every single time I was like, Joe, you have me for an hour and a half. I can't do any more than that.
Yeah.
I can't.
Well, I've just learned that about myself too, but that must be related to introversion, right?
I think
it's like
so.
You just hit a limit.
And the funny thing is, I don't think there is a lot of data. I mean, there might be some, but I don't think there's a lot of data on physiological correlates. But the one thing, and of course, we know personality trait research is like, it's a little fluffy. It's sort of like a construct that's a wiggly construct. But something that I have seen that has been tested over and over and kind of repeated, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know. I don't care. Reinforced, is that introverts tend to require minimal stimulation in order to get to like their baseline, whereas extroverts require more. And that seems to be the main difference, right? That an extrovert, it's very likely that when they study, they listen to like music, sometimes even with lyrics, which to me blows my mind. Or they're like, I need to go work in a coffee shop. Right. I'm like, how do you get anything done? Whereas I'm like, give me the noise-canceling headphones and a blanket. I need to be in a hole in my house. Otherwise, I can't focus.
Yeah.
So I think that's a big frontal lobe kind of thing with us.
Yeah. And on some level, you could think of it as sensitivity, too.
Yeah. It's like the external stimuli. Like our baseline, we need it to be really calm. Yeah. Like a nice candle, soothing music. And then other people just ramp it up. And then they feel like their true selves.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting.
That's and I do think it's funny because we always talk about there's 2 types of people in this world, but then there's like a million ways to slice that. But that is one of those of the big 5 personality features, traits, whatever you want to call them. Introversion versus extroversion does seem to have a lot of evidence to support it. Yeah. We got some introverts here, and the funny thing is, I think people make assumptions about your introversion or your extroversion based on your job, which is a little bit unfair because. A lot of people do things that are out of their comfort zone. Yeah. It's how they react to those things, I think there are CEOs left and right who are like exhausted by their jobs.
Yes, for sure they are. And I think Susan Cain has done a lot of great work to educate us on this subject. And it was a helpful education for me about myself. I learned a lot about myself reading her work. But no, it has a lot of connotations, some of which are true, some of which aren't, and some of which are true for some introverts and not for others. But there are these kind of core things that you mentioned that we all have in common. But it doesn't mean, I was just mentioning to you that I realized I love doing I shouldn't say love yet, but I enjoy doing in-person interviews much more than doing them from home, which I would normally think I would like to, be at home with my headphones on and not have to leave, which is true most of the time. But I actually love connecting with people. Yeah. And so doing an in-person interview, it doesn't necessarily correlate with shyness or not wanting to be around people. It's just the types of interactions and types of environments you're in that matter, I think.
I think so too. I actually do much better in small groups. Like I crave interpersonal contact, and I crave going to brunch with my friends. And
I'm the same.
Making eye contact, and but the bigger the group, the less I think you could actually get a connection.
The real connection. Yes.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. Yeah. So kind of coming back to your path throughout. So early on, when you were starting to sort of edit and give notes and coach and do those kinds of things with scientists, were you working more as like a ghostwriter? Was your name often showing up on their work, or was it sort of like deal to deal?
Deal to deal.
Okay.
And it absolutely depended on the writing ability of the scientist I was working with and how famous they may or may not have been. And so, it was across the board. I mean, my passion was really to make the work accessible to the general public.
Yeah.
And so, however I did that, each project, each job was very unique. But it entailed ghostwriting and editing and coaching, and sometimes from the very beginning working on book proposals and finding the right agent and just hand-holding through the whole process.
Yeah. It is true how I learned this. I hope I'm not like saying too much. I don't think I am. I'll be not cryptic, but I won't give too much detail. But like when on the other podcast I work on, The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, when we were approached to write a book, so there's 5 of us, and Steve, of course, Steve Novella is the host, and he's an academic neurologist. He's been doing this podcast since 2005, like almost 15 years. And, he's a very busy person. And when we were approached to write a book, he was like, okay, guys, we're writing a book. And I was like, wait, what's the deal? Who's the?
And how do we do it?
Yeah, and he's like, oh, we don't need an editor, we don't need an agent, we don't need. And I'm like, no, like because I've been working in TV for a long time. I have a literary agent. Yeah. Yes, and it's kind of like I think sometimes we forget when we're really good at one thing that we don't necessarily. It doesn't always translate.
Yeah, right.
And so it was a whole process just. Getting to a place where everybody was comfortable to kind of loosen the reins and say, oh, there are professionals who do this for a living. I need to trust that they know the process. And ultimately, we got a much bigger advance. We ended up with a bigger publisher. Yeah. We now have rights all over the world. It's amazing.
Glad you found someone to help you do it the right way.
Exactly. But I just can't even imagine how many, even like academics who have been doing academic publishing, through these different presses for years, when it's time for them to write a popular science book, think, oh, I can just do it all myself.
Yeah. Well, and the worst thing that can happen there is that for most nonfiction books, it's much better to not even write the book until you have a book deal.
Oh, you're right. And a lot of them just write the book.
So when people spend 2 years writing a book,
how sad. And then they can't get it published.
Or they have to basically redo the whole thing because it really starts from the proposal and then your relationship with the publisher and it's not like a novel where you're just telling a story. There's kind of a method to how you want to message whatever it is that you're talking about.
Well, you helped me like leaps, and I think that helped me be able to facilitate the hiring of an agent and the proposal process with SGU, because early on, when I started working more in television and podcasting, and I started having people come to me saying, we want you to write a book, which I still haven't done because I haven't had time.
Yeah.
And personally, I don't feel like my ideas are ripe yet, but I reached out to you early on and you sent me proposals from other authors.
I had completely forgotten about this, but now I remember.
Yeah, you gave me a lot of really good advice that at least pulled the curtain back.
Right.
And helped me get a glimpse of like, okay, there's a structured process in place that everybody goes through. And it actually calmed my nerves a little because I think I was under the impression that I would have to write something on spec before anybody would give me the time of day.
Yeah.
But it's like, no, you just have to show them that you can write the book.
Yeah.
And that the idea is a little bit hatched. Yeah. And so anybody listening right now who is even interested in publishing, like study the process because you're right. So many people probably do. It's like young filmmakers. They go and they make the entire movie. Then they have to remake the movie.
Right.
Because it's like, well, nobody's going to buy that movie. Like you use the wrong camera. It's like, oh no.
Yeah.
So sad. And so how cool for you to have known all of that yourself. And then didn't you, tell me if I'm wrong, I'm trying to remember, your first, this beautiful children's book that was illustrated by John Rowe, I Wonder, didn't you self-publish this?
I did. I mean, sort of. It doesn't officially fall under self-publishing.
Gotcha.
But it's like everything else I seem to do in my life in a totally unconventional way.
Yeah.
In a way, it was similar to how I came to write my new book, but it was, how a lot of people come to create something where I was looking for a book like this to read with my daughter, and I couldn't find one. I think I'd written a draft. I had started communicating with John Rowe, the artist, about doing this together, and then I just wondered, am I the only person who's looking for the fact that this book doesn't exist? And I asked a lot of developmental experts that I work with and that I consult with. Everyone was telling me there is not a book, a children's book about how to say I don't know, or that it's okay to say I don't know.
Yeah.
And it was so amazing, perplexing to me that this didn't exist. But I still didn't know. I've never done anything in children's books before. I didn't know anything about children's publishing, which turns out it's a completely different world from the world of nonfiction publishing. So it was the time where Kickstarter was getting big. And I thought this will be the perfect way to find out if there are enough people out there who want a book like this. So I did a Kickstarter campaign, and it was without having an agent, just, based on the idea and the illustrator I was working with. And it got such a strong response that I immediately got an agent, and then, people became interested. I ended up deciding I chose to publish it through a publishing company that my husband Sam and I started.
Gotcha.
So it's different from any other way someone might self-publish.
Because it's your own company.
Yeah. And we have a distributor. It's a true publishing company. So we have all of the avenues that you need to get books into bookstores, and it's just a very tiny little publishing company.
That's so cool.
And that was because I discovered in my research of children's books that you can lose a lot of creative control in the process. And for me, I don't even think I'm good at writing children's books. I actually think of this book as a book that I wrote for parents to read with their children.
Which is what a children's book should be.
Yeah, well, some of them should be. Some of them should be something that stories children want to enjoy, right?
True,
that is not something I would be good at all. So I felt like I was heavily relying on the artwork, and I also have a background in the arts. And so I was a photographer actually for many years. I had a photography business. So I knew that I wanted this to have a certain look. And so we went the route of going through our own publishing company just so I could maintain control over the whole thing.
I love that because obviously the content itself led you to want to maintain that kind of control. But I'd venture to guess, you would not have been able to do that if you hadn't been doing what you've been doing for a living for so long.
Yeah.
Like you had the know-how to be able to have the confidence to make the right decisions throughout that process.
Right.
And not a lot of people, I think that's kind of the American way, right? Like there's like a hubris of like, I'll just do it myself. And now it's funny because there are tools, like you can just look up how to do something on YouTube and you can just like.
Well, and I'd always thought of myself as having like too many interests, right? And when I get into something, I do it 1,000%. So, I was a professional dancer, and then I went back to school and studied photography, and I had a photography business, and I did all of these things very thoroughly, but I didn't actually see the dots connecting until much later in my life. But now I use all of these things that I've learned in publishing, in my writing, and even my new book, Conscious. I was adamant about working with a particular kind of illustrator, and I feel like this artist I worked with, Gemma O'Brien, is just phenomenal and
stunning. I can imagine
I many times have said to her, I hope the content is as good as the cover, because that might be the peak of the book might just be right there on the jacket, because her work is so beautiful. And it represents what I'm talking about so well. She read the book at an early stage before working on the illustrations.
So it was
but I feel like
inspired.
it's important. I mean, artwork is there's a reason why art is so powerful. And
this will be tattooed on many people.
Oh, I hadn't thought about that.
Really,
that's a great idea.
To me is such a stunning tattoo schematic. Like I'm really into tattoo art, and this like very black and white, very fine line with these like kind of, they're masculine and feminine at the same time.
Yes, I felt the same way.
Yeah, they're very deep and like kind of carnal, but still beautiful. Like this absolutely speaks to me.
Scientific and spiritual.
At the same time, which I absolutely love. So, I mean, now let's do it. Let's fully dive in. Conscious. Okay. That is such a important, meaningful, loaded, easily becomes what we like to call in my household vapor. Have you ever, this like easily can go pseudoscientific.
Yes.
These like, because it's.
That was one of my fears with this book too, which is why I consulted with so many scientists ahead of time also.
Well, and the thing is, I would never, coming from where you are, I would never fear that because you have a pure interest, right, in telling science and truth and philosophy. Right. The problem is that there are people out there who have not so pure interest in taking these fundamental scientific themes and terms and spinning them into something that they can't possibly be.
Yeah.
But the thing about consciousness is,
I write a little bit about that in the book too, just to try to prevent that as much as possible.
Well, it's important.
Like don't think you can use this as evidence for, New Age idea A, B, or C, because it doesn't actually. support any of those ideas.
My heart swells and bursts as you say that. But consciousness really, like, it's funny because when you were talking about I wanted to write this book and I couldn't find the books that had been already published to talk about it. And then you realize how many people are fundamentally interested in this too. Almost every person, I think, who goes to school to study psychology, neuroscience, human behavior, sociology, anthropology, deep down somewhere in them wants to understand this mystery. You know what I mean? It's sort of the final frontier in many ways.
Absolutely.
It's who we are. So like,
in some respects, it's everything.
It's everything.
Yeah.
And because nothing else.
It's really the only thing we know exists, which makes it sound a little spooky, but we literally could be living in a virtual reality. We could be brains in a vat. We can't. And now, everything that we've learned from quantum mechanics has just blown all of our intuitions out the window, and we don't know really what's going on at a fundamental level. But we know we are having an experience. It's the thing that's right here with us all the time. And whether or not, you're some icon in a strange AI system that I've been put into, the experience I'm having is very much here, regardless of what is actually out in reality.
Consciousness is in so many ways like you said, it's the portal. And without the portal, like it's the only thing we have. Yet it's so difficult to define.
Yes.
As a construct, it's not measurable, which is like what the actual heck. It's really it's something that I think logical positivists, like the most science-based thinkers out there, grapple with heavily because you can't there's no tool.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? There's no instrument to measure consciousness.
No, it's one of the great mysteries. And it was really, there were a couple ways I could go, but I was going to say initially it was the main reason I wanted to write a book about it, was just because I think it actually is something that almost everyone, if not everyone, is interested in, whether or not they know it.
Yeah.
And I think once they're introduced to it, they immediately become interested. And I noticed this in conversations and dinners and conferences. We all seem to very easily get these other mysteries, right? When we hear there's new information about black holes or the beginning of the universe, the Big Bang, all these things we want to understand our circumstance. We want to understand what the universe is made of. And when these topics come up that are so deeply mysterious, everyone tunes in, right? We're all interested in these great mysteries. And a lot of people actually don't know how mysterious consciousness is. So the very first goal I had with the book was simply to share this mystery, to kind of like call out to the world, like there's the Big Bang and maybe there's life on other planets and there's, all of these things we don't understand. There's space-time being curved by gravity and such deep mysteries out there, but you're actually living with one of these deep mysteries right now. It's right here with you. And this is actually as mysterious as all of those other things. And I kind of just wanted people who didn't know that to know that. I mean, we derive, I think, such benefit from just experiencing awe and curiosity and this is something that's so close to us that it's something we can kind of think about and investigate all the time. Whereas, understanding black holes is something you really have to go out and learn a lot of science.
You have to speak math.
To appreciate.
Yeah, and you do. You really, it's almost impossible to understand if you don't speak math because, so much of it's like counterintuitive. Right. It's interesting, this idea that you brought forward about kind of contextualizing what we know and what we don't know, because I find this all the time and I never thought I would, like coming from the academic world, it is what it is. You're surrounded by other academics and you kind of just take a lot of stuff for granted. And then when I started working in production, especially in science programming, I started to learn how limited most people's knowledge is. Right. That a very smart producer who has read up for years on this stuff would come to me and be like, okay, so for this thing, I think let's like do an experiment where we like, put on some sort of cap or something, and then we can tell which person's in love. And you're like, that's not a thing.
We haven't made that cap yet.
I know. It's like, and it's so common that people are like, there's this expectation that science knows more than it does, or that we have like more kind of neuro machines than we have. And that all of these things that I think one thing I've learned heavily working in clinical psychology now as opposed to neuroscience. When I was in neuroscience, everything was like, not just that it was evidence-based, but it was all like measurable, chemical, physical, or physiological. And now that I'm in
studies with very specific results.
Totally. And like there are only certain things you can measure. So everything you can't measure, we just don't even bother with.
Right. Yes.
And now that I'm in clinical psychology, the concept of the construct has become really a big part of my work. So it's like schizophrenia or love or anxiety. Like that's a construct. It's a human defined thing that we have decided is based on X, Y, and Z. And these are measures that we develop. And these are maybe some drugs that we figured out how to, but for the most part, we all just have to be in agreement about what it is. Otherwise, it's not like a thing that exists without us labeling it. It's this whole complicated thing. And I think consciousness in many ways, we know it's a thing, but the word consciousness has become this construct that's very difficult to grapple with.
I definitely try to tease that out and make it as much like neuroscience as possible, although I think the book really is more philosophy.
I love that.
Because it has to be.
How can it not be?
But I guess I could talk a little bit about the structure of the book and where I start, and then we can kind of take a little ride from there.
Yeah, and as you do that, I almost like, and you'll probably answer this in talking about the structure, but I almost, like, I feel like I have to take a step back and just ask you this question, which is like, conscious, a brief guide to the fundamental mystery of the mind. Where the hell do you even start? Like, you said you've been grappling with this for years, like, and you knew it was a book you wanted to write. I can't imagine the blank page anxiety that I would have felt. Like, how did you even know where to begin?
So, I mean, it was really in my own thinking about it that the book came about. So I just started where I started. And this actually kind of the structure of the book does really answer that question, because the thing I was most interested in was shaking up intuitions to see if we could be wrong about the things that we assume about consciousness.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And so, the goal of the book is really to shake up our intuitions. And I begin with the simplest intuitions we have about consciousness. So I actually see this as two categories of intuitions. One category is the intuitions we have about what consciousness is and what it's doing, and what purpose it serves, if any. And then there's another category of intuitions which are from other areas, but which inform our understanding of consciousness. And I think we definitely know that some of those illusions, some of those are false illusions. Some of those intuitions we have are false illusions, and we know this through neuroscience. And so we know some of the intuitions are false intuitions that are informing our intuition specifically about consciousness. But I'm also interested in if our very strong intuitions about consciousness are not as solid as we think they are. So when you say intuitions, do you mean both things that we think we know based on a bunch of experiments that we've been doing, and things that we think we know just because they have like good face validity? Like, it just seems reasonable? Well, for the most part, the science goes against our intuitions, and this happens a lot of the time. So I use the science to help with this thought process of breaking through some intuitions. And I like to give these examples because these examples of other areas in science where this is such an important thing to do. And I think it's so I'll just begin with some of those examples. And they're examples everyone is very familiar with. And you know this from your work, that in science, this type of thing happens all the time, where the simplest one is just understanding that the Earth is a sphere and not flat, as our senses lead us to believe, right?
Yeah.
We have to break that intuition in order to gain a deeper truth. And this is true in almost every example I can think of when we gain a more fundamental truth about the nature of reality, something that where our brains and our senses are just not designed to understand. Almost always, to make progress in science, we need to challenge our intuitions, and in some cases completely drop some intuitions that are completely misleading us. So the germ theory of disease is another good one, where this was very counterintuitive to people, and it took people a long time to accept the idea that microscopic things that we can't see or feel or taste, or we have no direct evidence that they're there, they not only make us sick, but they can kill us, right? These invisible things can kill us. And this is, of course, we've adjusted our intuitions based on culture and based on knowledge, but these are things that took a lot longer than most people realize to be able to accept as truths about the world because they were so counterintuitive.
Because we have to rely on a certain amount of authority. If we don't ourselves study this stuff, we have to rely on a certain amount of authority, which has all sorts of social connotations, because we don't have anecdotal evidence to support it, like personally anecdotal. I can't see the germs.
Yeah, exactly.
And so when you talk about these kinds of intuitions, the earth is flat, it's miasma that makes me sick, or like bad air, or whatever we used to think, that's really an evolutionary process, right? Like we evolved on planet Earth at a certain time, which is why we evolved to like be able to see movement the way that we do and color the way that we do and all that.
Right.
And a lot of these scientific constructs are bigger than that, or they're hidden by those kinds of things.
Or they're deeper, or they're smaller, or they're just, I mean, in physics, there are just an endless number of examples. Space and time, the fact that space and time, I mean, first of all, those are very hard for us to understand, period. But the fact that they're actually part of the same fabric that we now call space-time, which is curved by gravity. I mean, these are things we're just not meant to really be able to grapple with.
Because our brains did not evolve within that worldview.
That scale. Even.
Yeah, that scale. Exactly. Exactly.
So I think it's possible, it may not be, but I think it's possible that consciousness is one of those things. And I should probably define consciousness actually before we get into more details.
Please do.
You started there,
yeah. I'm like, it's a portal. That's not a good definition.
So I like to use the most basic definition to get at kind of the heart of what I mean when I say consciousness is mysterious. What is mysterious about it? What is that fundamental thing that we're pointing to? And I reference Thomas Nagel's definition in his famous essay, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? And he says, I might be paraphrasing here, but he says, maybe I should just look it up so I can read it.
Yeah, we could do that.
No, I have it here. So Thomas Nagel says, an organism is conscious if there is something that it's like to be that organism. So I like to use the word experience. So I see you running that through your mind, which a lot of people do. So so some people, that clicks with them right away and they know exactly what I mean. A lot of people, maybe even most people, it takes some time to wrap your head around that language. For some people, they actually can't get it through that language. Yeah. So I actually do like a follow-up for that. But before I do, it's essentially experience. If there's experience present, if there's something that it's like to be the organism, then that organism is conscious. And so for someone who's still stuck on that, I'll say, is there something that it's like to be you right now? And you don't even have to think about it, right? You just know right away, I'm having an experience. There's some experience being had. And then I'll say, is there something that it's like to be the headphones you're wearing? And of course, their answer is no.
Yeah.
And whatever new age idea you want to take on, it doesn't even matter what's true, right? That difference, there being an experience in a collection of matter in space, which everything is, and we now understand. I mean, this is kind of where the mystery came from, is once we understood in science that everything is made of the same ingredients, right? At the most fundamental level, these particles, this famous expression, we are stardust, is in fact true. And so the idea that at some point, certain collections of matter come together and they can get configured in just the right way so that now you have a brain or you have whatever the system is, that the molecules themselves, that the matter itself begins to light up from the inside, has an experience of being that matter in the world. That's the mystery. And that's what I'm calling. So people use the word conscious to refer to different things, but the mystery of consciousness that this book is about and that I'm talking about is that it's very simply experience, whether experience is present or not. And I think we have to be careful confusing it with complex thought.
Yeah, with like sentience or sapience or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, if you imagine, many people don't think worms are conscious, but if you imagine there's something that it's like to be a worm, or you can get, as simple a creature, if you don't believe worms are conscious, ants or bees or a mouse or whatever, wherever for you consciousness comes into play. You obviously don't need memory or complex thought or, much complex behavior going on. There can be a very, very simple form of experience. And we're still talking about consciousness.
You don't necessarily need even a brain. You just need a certain amount of neural kind of core tissue. Like you can have
so there's some there's disagreement about around this, of course. I mean, different people have different neuroscientists even have different speculations about where consciousness arises. And most think that you need a brain and a central nervous system. Others don't. But we all basically agree that at some point in some kind of complex processing, suddenly there's something that it's like. There's an experience from the inside.
Over. There's a threshold. There's a mechanism. There's a great, but we don't know what that is.
We don't know what that is.
It's so, and this speaks to me. I have to say, it speaks to me, and like especially the quote that you read, which I was like, I don't understand. Calculating, computing.
Everyone looks that way, by the way, when I read that quote.
They stare off into space and like
something that it's like. What does it mean? I mean, because it's the words aren't quite like the language isn't great. We don't have great language for it.
But I like it. It's like a little poetic, but also like it speaks to. So I have a quote on my tattooed on my ribs by Carl Sagan that I've referenced before on the show, and of course to me it's got a deeper. It's this, but it's also secularism. It's a lot of things that speak to me at a deep level, but. The quote is, "We are a way for the cosmos to know itself." And to me, what that always said is that we are the conscious portal for something that it can't in and of itself be conscious to reflect upon itself. You know what I mean?
Well, and we are a part of the universe. We often think of ourselves as separate. I touch on this a little bit in the book, but
you said we're made of all the same molecules.
Yeah, we're part of the universe. We're floating around in outer space. I mean, it's not like there's Earth and our solar system, and then there's like outer space the way we usually think of it. Like we're all part of it, and
yet something about our own consciousness separates us from it, or we choose to separate ourselves in a way because we are conscious. And those things,
I actually would say that's probably human thought, more than consciousness.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah, because you're right. Like I don't think that like dogs do that.
I don't think so.
All right, guys, let's get back to the show.
So the first two questions, so I go into these two different categories of intuition breaking, and one is just about consciousness itself, and I begin this journey, this thought process with two questions, and this is how it started for me, 15 years ago when I first started thinking about this, and I was just trying to get at what are our most fundamental, strongest intuitions about what consciousness is, and for me. It begins by asking these two questions. One is there anything we can detect from the outside of a system that we can say is absolute evidence that consciousness is present? Is there behavior we can point to and say, yes, when we see that behavior, for sure. I mean, at whatever level, like you can make it as complicated as you want and say we can't tell anything below this level. But when I come home and my daughter has skinned her knee and she's crying and asking for a Band-Aid, I can just use that as an example. For sure, consciousness is present there, right?
And so that's from an outside observer because of the observer bias when we're trying to self-observe.
Well, yes. And also because I'm going at this from a scientific perspective, I can know as everything I want to know about my own conscious experience because I'm here with it.
Yeah.
I can't know if my daughter is conscious or not ever, really. I mean, I can't have evidence of it, but I was curious, like, is there something we can observe that gives us? So for me, the answer that we all get, we have this very strong, and here we get at the intuition, we have this very strong intuition that yes, whether or not we can put them on a list, there are certain behaviors that are 100% evidence of consciousness. I think that's likely wrong. And if it's not wrong, there are very good reasons to challenge that intuition. So that's where I begin. That's the first intuition that I just invite the reader to just go. I mean, whether or not, we all end up being totally wrong on the other side. This whole book is about challenging these fundamental intuitions. So we really thought the earth was flat and it turned out we were wrong. Like, let's just take this one because we've had a very hard time making progress on this problem. And I think the only way we ever make progress on the really hard problems, as I said, is to challenge our kind of deepest intuitions on the subject.
The things that we feel to be true.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. So that was the first question I start with is there behavior on the outside? And then I take the reader through a whole discussion of why I think we shouldn't be as convinced of our immediate response to that as we think we are. And then the second question is actually very related, and I think they're intertwined, but it's a slightly separate question, which is consciousness doing anything? Is it performing a function? And we feel very strongly that it is. And so, to plan coming here today, to find the directions and read the email and get my notes together and, any kind of planning, I imagine my consciousness is driving that planning. I couldn't do that if I weren't conscious.
Yeah.
And that's another one that I think is very important for us to challenge. So I spend many chapters challenging from that starting point.
Ooh. That one's breaking my brain a little.
Okay.
That one is. I love it. Okay. I want to
So I can talk you through the first couple of chapters.
I want to dive into this. So
we may be here for 5 hours.
I know. It's great. Guys, it's a really short book. That's the cool thing about it. It's only, let me see, how many pages are it?
144, I want to say.
And it's small. It's not like
No, you can read it in a 90-minute sitting.
I love that. It's but then you can reread it and reread it and reread it, which I think is so important. Yeah. And it's something you can go back and reference in dog year. So the first question, because I want to get to the one that breaks my brain in a minute. But the first question about...
Before you even ask that question, should I give examples of the other types of intuitions first, or do you want to just take it one step at a time?
Of the other types of intuition.
So those are the intuitions about consciousness, and then there's another category of intuitions.
Yes. I want the whole structure first. Yes, and then we'll jump into it. Okay.
So the other category of intuitions are intuitions we have. The main ones are really free will, which I designate as conscious will, because I actually think they're slightly different things. I think it can be argued that we have, in some sense, we have free will, but having conscious will is something that I think is clearly an illusion.
Interesting. Yeah.
And I think is at this point proven to be an illusion by everything that we know about the brain. And we're still struggling. I mean, it's kind of like the germ theory of disease, where there are things we know about brain processing now that should have shattered some intuitions by now, and they haven't, even amongst neuroscientists.
But I'm glad you make that distinction, because you're right. I think a lot of people take the construct of free will, and it's either... does our brain make decisions before we're conscious of them versus is there like a God that tells us what to do? And those are two very different things.
Yeah.
No. And a lot of people conflate.
Yes. It's funny. I never hear it described that way as a God, but no, it's or determinism or
whatever. Yeah. However, is the universe already have a path and you're just floating along this path?
Well, and there's an argument for that as well. But for the purposes of this conversation, all that you need to recognize is that conscious will is in many senses an illusion, if not an outright illusion.
And that's this idea that there study after study, psychological study after study show that you are making decisions or doing things, or your brain is doing things long before you're aware that you're even doing them.
Consciousness seems to come out pretty late in that process.
Okay, cool.
And there's some new studies actually that are interesting. I might leave one with you.
Oh, nice. Yeah, that's awesome.
And then these things are all interconnected and related, but so it's free will and then also the illusion of the self.
Yeah.
And so those are almost the same thing. I mean, they're different experiences, but they're both illusions to some extent, if not to the full extent, and they very much inform our intuitions about consciousness.
And the funny thing is, the illusion of the self, which I think I would agree is it's a deeply held illusion.
It's so deep.
It's also fundamentally, the illusion itself is fundamentally important for psychological health.
Yes and no. I think this is like consciousness, where you can use the self. It can be used to describe a few different things.
True. Yeah, you've got to define the constructs always.
But it's true. I mean, across the board, even at the fundamental level that I'm using the word self, which I don't mean autobiographical self. I'm not talking about. Maybe I should make this distinction
memory
now.
And personality.
Just simple things like my name is Annaka and I'm here talking to Cara and I am interested in science and I have 2 daughters, all of that. And then anything that comes with that, feeling shy or
I'm an introvert.
Right, all of that. So obviously that's all very important for psychology.
Yeah.
But there's a deeper version of that where I could wake up, I could have amnesia, wake up tomorrow having no idea who I am. Knowing none of those facts, but still have an intact feeling of self. So I would be saying to you, I don't know my name. I don't remember. I don't know who I am. I don't know where I am. But there's still a very strong feeling that I'm an I, right? The I hasn't disappeared.
And that's the thing that I think a lot of people who are super interested in like psychedelic drugs, people who are interested in existentialism at its core, are fascinated by, because we do have these fleeting moments throughout our life, these boundary experiences, whether it's from doing drugs or staring up at the sky or having vertigo or whatever, where we might actually lose that deeper sense of self for a moment. And it's terrifying.
Well, it can be. People have different responses to it.
True.
So it can be terrifying in a certain context. For many people, I mean, there's all this new research on psychedelics now, and Michael Pollan's book is fantastic. And I talk about some of this in the book, actually. But you can have an experience of seeing through the illusion of self. So kind of dropping that illusion in the same way that you would see through a visual illusion, right? Where you might be shown something on a two-dimensional surface that completely you're convinced is three dimensions, a ball, or I don't know if I'm sure you've seen a bunch of these illusions. They're
awesome.
Amazing.
There's like
but then you change your view a little bit and you realize like, wow, that's just a flat drawing. There's a way in which you can see the sense of self that way, where you can really actually kind of break through it and realize see it as an illusion. And this is a common experience in people who spend a lot of time meditating, but it's also common in certain, after taking certain psychedelics. And that experience itself is one of the reasons why it's so effective in treating PTSD and treatment-resistant depression, is that under the right circumstances, seeing through that illusion or seeing the self as an illusion actually gives you a sense of being deeply connected to others, to the planet, to the universe, in a way that you have a deep sense of well-being.
Interesting. It's actually more
kind of like
grounding.
Everything's going to be okay.
Yeah.
Many people who are in an end-of-life circumstance where they have terminal cancer and they do this therapeutically guided psychedelic session, they come out the other side of it with a calm and peacefulness and acceptance of death unlike they've ever experienced before. And these are often people who have been completely crippled by their anxiety. But it seems that losing or seeing through the illusion of self is part of that mechanism for actually getting that deeper sense of wellness. And it is the default mode network that's being acted on both in meditation and when people are on psychedelics that allows people to break through that
I just
illusion.
wrote a big paper about that.
You did?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm telling you everything you already know.
No, not about psychedelics, though. I didn't even touch on that. But about meditation's ability to, and we know that the default mode network is the network that lights up, quote unquote, when you're passively doing, when your mind is wandering, it does seem to have a very deep tie to what we think of as this more fundamental sense of self, a sense of identity or a sense of like personhood. I guess is a good way to put it. A grounding.
I mean, it's interesting, just the sense of self. I mean, the more I think about it, and I write about it a little bit in the book, but almost like the religious conception of a soul, which I've never been religious, and I still have this very strong feeling. And I'm someone who knows a lot about the brain. I work with neuroscientists, completely understand intellectually that everything I experience is a product of brain processing, right?
Yeah.
But I still feel like I, whatever that means, am someplace that I almost stand outside my brain, that, my brain could be doing some kind of processing that makes me very, I'm feeling very sleepy, but I somehow over here, I don't know where that I is outside of my brain, but I can override that. I can decide I'm not going to go to sleep, or I'm not going to eat that third cup of ice cream, or, whatever it is. I think that I somehow stands outside of the material world. And so it's a very, very strong illusion that even people who grew up in a totally secular environment, it's a strong illusion that every human being has.
And it's a strong illusion that very, very smart people grapple with every day. I'm reminded of, if you feel like I'm scanning behind you, it's because I'm looking at my bookshelf. I have a book by Karl Popper and Eccles, which is like a classic book that I read in the philosophy of psychology course that I took in graduate school, called The Self and Its Brain. And really that becomes this back and forth argument by a lot of neuroscientists and philosophers. It's like, does the self own its brain, or does the brain own the concept of the self? And I'm probably more on the classical kind of.
Well, I think the self is truly an illusion. And the more we know about neuroscience, the more that just becomes very obvious.
But it's such a strong illusion that it gives you the sense that the self owns the organic structure in a heavy, heavy way.
Yes.
Which is so fascinating.
So it's these two types of categories that I explore pretty deeply in order to kind of lay the groundwork for, to whatever extent we're able to, break through those intuitions if it will help us get to a deeper understanding of consciousness.
And like your brain might bleed out of your ears while you're doing it, but in a good way, guys, in a good way. No, it's fascinating. So we're actually...
But it's a short and I've been told readable book, and I can say I wasn't totally sure. I wasn't able to make it as accessible as I had hoped. And I thought, at the end, I thought this is just the best I can do. And I thought maybe the audience will be different from what I originally imagined. But many, many people, I'm so grateful and happy that this is the case, many, many people without backgrounds in science who were just curious about the topic said they blasted through it in a sitting, and that there's many things they feel like they need to think about and read through again, but that it is as accessible as I hoped it would be. So
well, and I think that there's a difference between when we talk about science communication and we talk about accessibility. I think that there's different layers of accessibility, and something that I always struggle with when I'm working like in public science communication is this idea, my number 2, I always have a list of like top 5 things for SciComm. And one of the ones that I reiterate that I think resonates with people is never underestimate the intelligence of your audience, but always underestimate their vocabulary. And so I feel like sometimes if we can cut through the jargon.
That's a great way to describe it.
Yeah, like the topics themselves might still be deep and complicated, but that doesn't mean that fundamentally they're not human and that people won't connect with them. So even though it seems like
human beings are deep and curious by nature.
Yeah. So maybe you have to read it 3 times for it to make perfect sense in your mind, but it doesn't mean you're not going to grasp it at a deep conceptual level. So I do think like it's accessible in the sense that it's deep and meaningful. It's you made it accessible because you didn't make it jargon heavy. And that's the important thing. But of course, it's always going to be not as easy to read as a comic book. You know what I mean? Although some comic books are deep as hell.
That's true.
So true. Like that's a whole thing. So coming back to your first 2 questions.
Okay, yes.
Can you reiterate what they were first?
Okay. So the first one is there behavior? Is there something we can witness from the outside of a system that is absolute evidence that consciousness is present in that system? And the second one is there something consciousness is doing? Is it serving a function? Is it in fact behind all of our behaviors in the way that we feel it is?
So it's not so much about it being purpose-driven, it's just about it being functional.
I'm not sure I understand.
Like there's not like you're not asking whether or not there's a goal of consciousness. You're just asking whether or not
whether it's actually doing anything.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So coming back to the first one, are there outside observable, measurable kind of scientific, as it were, behaviors? Can you give some examples of the things that people would usually use if they're making a list of those things?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think I'm just going to come up with a few on the fly because they happen all the time. Yeah. They're happening right now in this conversation, right? There's so many things you're doing that are a clue to me that you're conscious, right?
I hope so.
But they're usually emotion-driven things. Like I said, if I came across my daughter, she's skinned her knee, she's crying. If a friend is excited about a trip they're going, almost any communication of any experience seems that way. But we can even witness this in animals, of course, right? We most of us assume that animals are conscious, and we see a dog exhibit a certain behavior. They look worried. They seem concerned. They're barking. You imagine there's some experience that's present there.
Yeah. Even something like an earthworm, what we were talking about before, that some people might think of as a threshold, or like a fruit fly, a threshold organism. They have responses to stimuli.
Yes, although that to me gets below what we would say, like, yes, that is conclusive evidence. Because you could make the case that a fly is kind of an automaton and doesn't actually have an experience. It's not complex enough to be having an experience.
So even though there might be a toxic smell or something and they avoid it, they might not be choosing to do that, or it might not be something they're aware of.
Or I might not have any experience at all of it. So if you imagine I created a little robot fly, right, that you wouldn't even think to question whether it was having an experience. And all right, it's a little robot that moves away from toxins, and it's a little robot fly I made in my in my lab.
Yeah. Your robot fly lab.
It doesn't even come up, right? We expect that collection of matter to be, in terms of consciousness, the same as this book right here, right? There's just nothing that it's like to be that thing.
Yeah.
And so then I take the reader through one counterexample, which I think is an interesting place to start, which are conditions you, I'm sure, are well aware of, where there is no behavior at all, but a full experience of consciousness on the inside, even a very complex one. So,
like ALS?
Yeah. So that would be one. I took one more extreme than that, which is locked-in syndrome.
Yeah.
So
which is even more severe. Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
So I talked through some cases, some of which people were actually able to communicate because it was a very single point of mobility that someone happened to notice, like an eyelid. But these are cases, people with locked-in syndrome are completely paralyzed, you will never witness any behavior coming from them. They're having as full a conscious experience as I'm having right now. So we know, so I kind of started there. We know the opposite is true. Like we'll look for behaviors in a minute, but first let's just start with, it's not necessary.
Yeah.
Right? And anesthesia awareness.
Sure. It happens, right?
Yeah.
Sadly. Ooh.
Too often.
I've never had
It's become my
anesthesia,
worst nightmare.
I know.
My worst fear.
Yeah. I'm super scared of anesthesia for that reason. I don't want to be aware, but I have a friend who had an open heart surgery and she was fully,
And she could feel pain as well.
I think she could. I mean, she definitely was aware of
There are different
fear.
versions of it. People are kind of aware and sometimes people don't experience pain. But the people who have just the full experience of anesthesia awareness, it's always traumatic. And some people just never recover. I mean, it's such a traumatic
bad
experience.
PTSD from it. Yeah. And stuff post that
Understandably.
too.
But the point for my book is a less upsetting one.
Yeah.
Which is just that there may be behaviors that we can find that we can say are conclusive evidence, but it's definitely not required, right? You can have that. You can have as full experience as the one I'm having right now without any behavior on the outside.
And we also see it, right, sometimes with people who are like minimally conscious or like somewhere on a Glasgow coma scale, and then later they come out and they can recall things
about
from
their
room.
experience.
Yeah. And they can say, I was fully present when you were having this conversation.
Yeah. And so there's sometimes we just can't know.
Yeah.
And then I go back to, let's see if we can find behaviors. And what I do there to undercut our intuitions is I start to talk about very basic behaviors in plants, which is, I went down this rabbit hole. It's super interesting. I learned so much about plant behavior, and a lot of their behavior is very similar to the types of behaviors we would identify in us as being evidence of consciousness. And so I bring plants up not because I think plants are conscious, but because we all assume they're not conscious. There's no experience of being a palm tree, right? But when you look at the details, they are avoiding obstacles. I mean, there are tons of examples of just
turning to the sun and
they're moving all the time. First of all, ivy is
growing.
It's not just growing. Yeah, they actually move. So they move when they're growing, but they actually move despite their growth. I mean, plants move a lot during the day. They're able to sense a lot of things in their environment, light and dark and touch and sound and all of these things they're actually processing. And most of the work I learned about was through Daniel Shamovitz, who wrote a book. I hope I get this right. I think it's, I'm forgetting the name of his book. What do plants know? What plants know? Something like that.
I'm going to look it up.
Okay.
And then I'll tell you.
It's so great. I really recommend it.
Daniel Shamovitz.
Shamovitz.
CHA Shamovitz. What a plant knows. You got it. Yeah. So you want to just pick that up, you can.
Okay. So Shamovitz wrote this book, What a Plant Knows. And he talks about he goes through every level of sense. And the types of things that plants are responding to in their environment. And it turns out that we share some of the same genes, which you're probably aware of, but I wasn't until
And oftentimes they have way more genes than we do.
Right.
Like they're more complicated in their genome.
Yes, they can be. But so the gene that plants use to determine whether they're in the light or dark, human beings have the same gene in their DNA, and it is functional in all kinds of things like circadian rhythms, and it's involved in much more complicated processes in human beings. But the interactions between cells and the electrical signals that are being sent are not so different from those that happen in animals that it starts to get you to question whether any of those things are evidence of consciousness.
Yeah, because like you said, one of the ways
Because
that you can flip over is to say like, well, nobody thinks a plant is conscious, but there are some people who, when they think about this stuff, they're like,
then they start to wonder if plants are conscious.
I think I need to assume that plants are conscious.
Well, there's that. You can go in that direction too, and that's a super interesting direction to go down. But the reason I bring it up in the book is just because it's a good example of something that we assume is not conscious, but that displays a lot. Whenever we come up with our own examples of behavior, when you break down the behavior to its simplest form, they closely resemble plant behaviors. And there's this work done by Susan Simard, who studies mycorrhizal networks, the fungal networks underneath forests.
Fascinating.
And all of the communications between trees and their ability to recognize their own kin and to give more carbon to their own seedlings that are growing and not to, it's a complicated universe under there. And they're doing a lot of things that we would call love and protection and fear and warning the next generation of the poisons nearby, all of these things that at a cellular level are so similar to what's going on in us that it shakes up our intuitions.
Absolutely.
It's a way to start wondering if we're not thinking about consciousness right. And one of the things that I've arrived at that I think is interesting is that a basic assumption about consciousness is that it arises out of very complex processing, that you need the most complicated thing in the universe that we know of, a brain. You need a brain for it to arise.
We always go to the human brain first, right? Like, it's the most complicated. And it's like, wait, but it's not just us.
Yeah, other animals have brains. And we don't really have evidence for that. And so it's interesting to start to contemplate, at least to be open to whether consciousness is not based on complex processing, whether it's actually much more simple.
But do we need neurons? And do we need, there's still that intuition that I hold on to even as somebody who's, kind of tangentially studies the stuff, which is like, but a tree or a fungal network or whatever, they're not self-reflective. But do you have to be self-reflective to be conscious?
No. So, no, just basic experience, just having an experience. And so this is kind of where my book forks for some period of time to the more far out theories, which when I first encountered them, completely dismissed, which is part of the reason why I feel like I'm a good proponent of them, because it took me a long time to become open to them.
Because you're sufficiently skeptical as you're approaching them.
Yes, and I assume, like most of the neuroscientists I know and most of the scientific community, that all of these assumptions I'm pointing to about consciousness arising out of complex phenomenon and requiring a brain. And those were all my very, very strong assumptions.
Are very anthropocentric assumptions.
Right. Yeah. But the more I thought about it, it was, in some sense, it was the more I thought about it than the more research I did. The more I played these like thought experiments in my mind and really forced myself to let go of as many intuitions as possible, the more I started feeling like I was contemplating this category of theories, which is usually called panpsychism, which is a terrible name. And
it sounds really wooey, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. And it's, of course, used to back up all kinds of pseudoscientific and obviously false descriptions of the universe. But the basic panpsychism is really an umbrella term for theories which postulate that consciousness is a more fundamental feature of the universe.
Interesting.
That it could be like an intrinsic property of matter at the level of, individual particles. And so this sounds completely crazy. I rejected it for a long time. It is. I'm not convinced by it at all.
Because it's definitely not intuitively.
It's totally counterintuitive.
Yeah.
And it does not sound scientifically valid until you spend a lot of time thinking about it and realizing that if some of our assumptions are wrong, which they could be, this category of theories makes a lot of sense. And when I first started writing about it, I didn't want to write about it, actually, because I just thought it would be the end of my career. But I thought there must be a way to present these ideas, in a very skeptical way, saying, I have no idea if this is right or not, but why is it that these theories aren't talked about more seriously? And so I sent the manuscript to many scientists the scientists I thought would be most skeptical and would give me the harshest criticism.
Yeah.
What's interesting is many of them were very happy that I was writing the book for this reason.
Wow.
That many of them were interested in these theories, had come to some version of this theory on their own. Most of them were physicists, but there are a couple of neuroscientists.
Yeah, I wonder if the neuroscientists have like a stronger holdover and the physicists are more open to exploring that.
Yes.
Yeah.
For sure.
Because physicists have already become comfortable with concepts like string theory, where even if they're personally not string theorists, they're like, it's a viable alternative.
Yeah.
And it could be totally wrong, but it could be totally right. And we have to be open to it.
Yeah. No, physicists have just gotten to the point where nothing is intuitive.
You're so right.
We don't know. I mean, every solution you come up with to the math and just to the obvious evidence of the things that are happening in quantum mechanics. I mean, we're using this stuff to build technology. It works, right?
Yeah. So we know it's quote unquote true.
Yeah.
To some extent,
but what it actually means about the universe we live in, we really don't know.
Yeah.
And the possibilities are just one is crazier sounding than the next. So yeah, physicists are very used to living in this crazy world where there could be endless
multiple
amount of
dimensions
and multiple universes where there's eternal number of you and I having this conversation, but in one you ask me a different question, and
in the other I have like a goatee.
Right, exactly. Physicists in general are more open to this, but there are some neuroscientists
That's awesome.
as well.
Okay.
And I think it is, at the very least, it is a valid category of theories that I think we should be entertaining, especially as we continue to make no progress on the hard problem of consciousness. Some of these scientists who were giving me feedback on the manuscript were very interested in these types of theories and interested in contemplating whether or not consciousness could be something that's not complex but more simple, and something that is possibly an intrinsic property of matter. They absolutely felt like they could never say anything like this publicly, and they had to say it to me off the record, and so that in and of itself became more of a reason for me to write about this, because I feel like we need some kind of shift in this area in terms of being open to intuition challenging theories and ideas. And brilliant scientists who are interested in these theories, at the very least, need to feel free to express their ideas or their interests.
It is sad, right, that it does seem like there's more of a freedom in physics to break intuition and feel safe doing it and say this is still sanctioned by the intellectual kind of crowd. Mm-hmm. Whereas in psychology and neuroscience, when people go that route, it so easily can be co-opted by the Deepak Chopras of the world that people are like, oh, well, you're just a woo monger and I'm just going to discount everything you say from now on. It's almost like only philosophers have that freedom. And that's a bit unfair that a neuroscientist can't dabble in these philosophical ideas.
Absolutely. I mean, especially if there's some creative way to be thinking about them in terms of research.
Yeah. I mean, where can we start to interrogate this stuff in a meaningful way? I mean, there's one person, there's a couple people I know who are doing this, but as far as I'm concerned, there should be 100 people working on this, right? Well, and this book, I think, in a way, maybe starts that process of giving permission to be able to do that, because it's like, this is an intellectually rigorous and interesting study on these things. Like somebody finally took these ideas and couched them in a way that's legitimate instead of immediately going to like crystals and magic and healing and like all this stuff that's like, God, no, don't misappropriate in that way. So that's really cool. And I think it's important because you are a skeptic and you are a secular thinker, that you understand that contextualization. Like you're responsible in that way.
Yeah. So I hope so. I mean, that really, it's as I said, I started writing the book because I just wanted to share this mystery with everyone. I wanted as many people who wanted to contemplate it could have this opportunity to discover how mysterious it is. But no, it pretty quickly shifted to, I hope this can make the topic a little less taboo. One thing I should say, actually, as we're talking about it being taboo, I should make it clear that all of these theories, at least the ones that I take seriously and think are rigorous and interesting, in no sense does consciousness get confused with complex thought.
Okay.
And so having some level of experience, I mean, the truth is, if it's true, it's possibly true that some level of experience exists, at the level of atoms.
Yeah.
We would never expect atoms to have complex thoughts or intentions, or they're not human minds, right?
Yeah.
So we wouldn't expect this table to get up and go make a cup of coffee. We wouldn't expect this table to feel anything like what we feel, right? It would be, the matter is configured in a very different way, and the experience present there is assumed by people who postulate these theories to be completely unrecognizable to us in terms of the experience, the character of it.
And so your kind of construct threshold for consciousness, your definition, when we were going back to that conversation, was about experience and not necessarily, like, if you were to ask me without digging deep into the research like you did, just based on kind of what's in my head right now from what I've read and from blah, blah, I might use the word awareness instead of experience when I talk about consciousness. Yeah. But that actually is a whole extra kind of layer that you have to start to break apart.
Yes.
So you're going deeper than that. You're going to experience.
Yes.
And I actually feel like the more we're talking about this, the more I'm like, Annaka, can you write a book about life next? Like, like right now you're grappling with the consciousness. Even deeper than that is like, how do we define what's actually alive and what's not alive? Yeah. And like, because that doesn't even require experience.
Those boundaries are blurry too.
I know.
It's pretty interesting.
I feel like it's just an extension of this conversation. It's like a drill down even deeper below consciousness.
I mean,
becomes
it's
life.
all mechanics at some level, right? It's all
just how those atoms and those subatomic particles are arranged. Yeah. And somehow the levels of complexity grow and grow, and then it becomes life, and then they grow and grow, and then it becomes consciousness, and eventually they grow and grow, and it becomes awareness, and then sentience or sapience or however, and there's levels all the way down. Yeah. And it's freaking awesome when it really comes down to it.
Well, and then the next part of the conversation is and will be artificial intelligence as we create more and more advanced artificial intelligence. And
these neural nets that are
what is required for consciousness.
Recursive,
how do we think about these things? And if there's something more complex than the human brain, does it by definition entail consciousness or not?
And does this stuff, is this stuff emergent? Does it just arise once all the building blocks are there? Or do they have to be put together in a special way and a special kind of flip be switched? Yeah. Switch be flipped. I always mix those up.
I have an argument against the emergence explanation in my book.
That's always been my most safe and comforting definition
You'll lose it when you read that part of the book. Yeah.
No. It's so funny because, definitely psychology, identity, all of these, what we think of as psychological principles, I've always defined when I start to try and grapple with them as an emergent property of brain. So you've got brain, and then when brain is functioning.
I think you actually can. I mean, I think you can
have both those things be true.
You can have behaviors be emergent. I think you just can't have consciousness be emergent because emergence technically is a description of a physical system from the outside. It's something that's observed from the outside. And by definition, consciousness is not that. It is something intrinsic. It doesn't matter what. It's irrespective of the behavior or the processing. Like if that processing is having an experience.
It's conscious.
Right. But emergence doesn't explain that other feature, that other property. And emergence, I think in almost every case, is a description of a very complex system. Yeah. And if, this is something I question throughout the book, and it may in fact be a result of complex processing, but we don't have evidence of that. And so if consciousness is a very simple phenomenon, then emergence doesn't apply.
Yeah, these are almost to some extent philosophical, theoretical explanations for something that we haven't really necessarily developed logical positivist interventions or interrogations for. And that's where that kind of, I think, important that important bridge exists within academia, that people who stick, I think, too strongly to the logical positivist view, which is that, like, if I can't measure it, it's not even relevant. Because I don't think anybody has the pure perspective anymore. I could be wrong, that if I can't measure it, it doesn't exist. But at least if I can't measure it, it's not relevant to the conversation, I think is a more classic view in that world. And it's something that a lot of skeptics, I struggle on Skeptics Guide to have these conversations. Like, just because we don't know how to interrogate it yet, or maybe we never will, doesn't mean that it doesn't have meaning or purpose in people's lives.
Well, and I mean, that's something I point to also in the book, is just we forget how young we are as a species, right? There is think of how far we've come from what we understood when we thought spirits made us sick, or,
Yeah, or even before we had, before we were people, we were, precursors. We were ape-like creatures. And before we were ape-like creatures, we were whatever. And we crawled out of the ocean, and we were just like bacteria, archaebacteria.
And in the scheme of things, that's been a very short period of time. But from the moment we started being able to understand the fundamental nature of reality, we are very young. And especially in terms of neuroscience, we're at the very beginnings of understanding.
The last seconds of existence.
So we have, I like to remain, there's certain things I always like, consciousness, that I wonder if we will ever really be able to understand. And there have to be limits to our knowledge, as much as we don't want that to be the case. Yeah. And consciousness may just be, beyond our limits. But I like to remain optimistic and think we can, because we really are at the beginning stages of understanding the nature of the universe, and we, there's so much yet to be understood.
I fully believe that we'll be able to understand more, much more. But my question to you is, based on what you just said, do you think, to some extent, that those same physical principles in quantum mechanics of observer bias, like just being the thing that's observing the phenomenon, changes it so much that its quote unquote fundamental nature, whatever that even means, is never going to truly be known? In order to know it, we have to know it from its perspective.
Maybe.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Carlo Rovelli's new book, I don't know if you've seen it, The Order of Time. Yeah. It's so good.
Also very small and readable.
Yeah, small and readable. And he ends on a discussion of consciousness, which I emailed him immediately when I got to the end of that book, because, I start with consciousness and end on time, and he starts with time and ends on consciousness. And there is some way in which it's hard to separate out.
Yeah, and Sean Carroll's been grappling with that a lot lately too. I noticed that he did a blurb on your book, and he's been, always.
He was wonderfully helpful, and we had discussions about some of the things I talk about in the book.
Yeah, because I think that it's funny that both, usually more like theoretical physics or cosmology, and this more kind of deeper neuroscientific, philosophical, psychological, neuroscientific approach, really in some ways are grappling with similar. Fundamental I don't want to call them problems, but fundamental questions.
Yeah, and mysteries.
And religion, too, to some extent, grapples with those things. I mean, I think it's just it's a human nature to know thyself, to want to know thyself. Yes. And that's really what it all comes down to.
Yeah.
Yeah. Annaka, this is so fascinating. It's so funny that we could talk for 20 hours about a book that you said you could read in 90 minutes, which I think is a testament.
But it's kind of the beginning of a conversation, right?
True. But it's also, I think, a testament to your ability to drill down and to organize and to focus and to do the things that very easily could float away. It's your testament. It's a testament to your skill as a writer, really.
Thank you.
So guys, the book is Conscious, A Brief Guide to the Fundamental Mystery of the Mind. There's so much more we could talk about, but I've already kept Annaka for an hour and a half, which is ooh, sorry. I do close every episode by asking my guests the same two questions.
Okay.
So, and they're big picture questions, which you're so good at. So, are you ready to dive into that?
I don't know. I have a feeling I won't be good at this, but go ahead.
I know. I'm oh no, I don't want to throw you off. Here we go. So, when you think about the future in whatever context is relevant to you right now, so it could be quite personal or it could be like a big global, larger than thyself kind of future. The first thing I want to know is, what is the thing that's been keeping you up at night that you're grappling with, that maybe you have like a little bit of pessimism, maybe even cynicism about? Like, what are you legitimately concerned about? And then on the flip side of that, just so we don't like end super depressing, what are you genuinely optimistic for? Yeah, like what do you really look forward to and have hope about?
Oh, there's so many answers to both.
Right? I mean, you can give like multiple if you want.
Okay. I mean, the first thing that came to mind is really just the future of, it's really the big one, the future of humanity. Yeah. And I also just happened to have in my consciousness very recently a TED Talk by Rob Reed, which just came out yesterday.
Oh, okay. What's it about?
I saw live, and he's become a friend of mine. And,
oh, cool.
He and I are actually doing that event in San Francisco. But it's about kind of whether we will persevere as a species and all of the obstacles to doing that. And so, yes, I passionately hope and believe that we can, but I worry that we won't. And yeah, there's so many directions humanity could take us. So,
and you can slice and dice that. And you know what I think? You've really reached a fundamental nature of that question, because I think a lot of people come on the show, when I ask them, what are you genuinely concerned about? They'll talk about things like climate change or war or tribalism or all these things. But I think all of those things are encapsulated in this sort of like eschatological concern, which is like, will we persist?
Yeah. Well, and the specific thing that came to mind was technology. And I don't know if that's because that's what Rob's talk is about. It also kind of seems like the most obvious way we could go wrong catastrophically. But even just more personally for me with my kids, it's the thing that I feel most stuck on, the thing I need most advice about.
Oh, like screen time.
Yeah, I mean, just as simple as screen time to it's just a whole new world that is changing so quickly that none of us have enough time to get experience or data.
Yeah, the evidence isn't in yet, is it?
No, and it won't be in, because by the time it's in, there'll be something new.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
We were in some ways the test subjects because we existed before and after the internet age. And the children, like I don't have children, but when I say our children, it's like it's all they've known. They're steeped in it.
Yes.
And they're the guinea
and we're
pigs.
trying to help them navigate social and emotional learning with it there, and with all the benefits that come with it, and then with all the kind of unknown risks.
But we're doing that, completely with our hands behind our back, because we don't know.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, we don't.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we're mostly going on intuition, which is sometimes very helpful and sometimes not helpful at all. But yeah, it's technology is where the big questions are. Like, where is this taking us?
And it really is that kind of ambivalence of like the greatest harm and the greatest reward and power, all wrapped up into the same package. Ethics is a big conversation that we don't have enough there. Okay, so what about on the flip side of that? Is there something that you're like really, really hopeful, like genuinely, it's not just lip service, that you're hopeful for?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of in the same realm. Science has always been something that's made me hopeful, and that's why I've always been drawn to it. Yeah, I think we have this incredible capacity as human beings to get so far beyond what we're kind of designed by evolution to understand. And I think that's where the answers lie for almost everything.
Yeah.
And I'm excited to see what else we discover.
Me too. Oh, Annaka, this was a fascinating chat. I honestly, I feel like we could go. It's so funny.
We could.
We're just talking about how we're gonna have to meet for lunch
soon to finish our conversation.
Please. Yeah. Well, once again, I will tell you guys, the book is Conscious, A Brief Guide to the Fundamental Mystery of the Mind, and you can pick it up now. Annaka, thank you so much for joining me. It was a blast.
It was a blast. Thank you.
And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.